So welcome to everybody to our first capstone chat of the semester. We are very lucky to have Michael Theis come and speak to us. He is an alumni of the department, and he has been rather successful in keeping a career thriving as a journalist in these kind of interesting times. I guess there's no better way to put it, where journalism is really having a lot of changes occur. So I'm going to let him, as usual, tell his story. And if any point in time you have a question, just go ahead and put in the chat, I have a question. And Mike, do you feel comfortable with just keeping an eye on that, or do you want me to keep an eye on it and let you know if there's a question? How do you want to run it?
I feel comfortable doing that. I've just activated my chat window.
Okay, so everybody just say I have a question, and Mike will answer you as needed, but here we go.
Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Theis. I am currently the staff writer for data and accountability at the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I'm basically going to be cribbing from my bio, at least for this portion. The Chronicle of Philanthropy is a trade publication focused on policy which affects charities and those who don't donate to them, those who are doing the philanthropy. I graduated in 2006 from Shepherd University. I majored in mass comm with a minor in photography. And during my time at Shepherd, I focused a lot of my mass comm curriculum, especially towards the later years, around videography. My senior project, I don't think we had yet started calling them capstones at that point. My senior project was a pre-YouTube day sketch comedy video website where I just made sketch comedy videos that I really can't look at these days because they make me cringe.
I looked at them before.
Oh yeah,
They're still there.
yeah, and I've got them on Facebook and stuff. There's just, when you put a certain creative distance between yourself and your work, after a while, I really start to hate my old stuff whenever I look at it. While I was at Shepherd, I also did my internship at what was then WHAG NBC 25 in Hagerstown. That is now if I'm not mistaken, WDVM in Hagerstown. I worked there as a studio videographer, and then I did a brief stint as a master control operator, is basically running the transmitter and cutting between studio programming and network programming and just cutting between feeds. I got fired from that job because I fell asleep at 3 a.m. and broadcast a black screen for 51 minutes. Something that the FCC had to get involved with because you're not allowed to do that with a federally licensed radio transmission. Then I worked at the Frederick News Post as a videographer and photographer. Technically, I was the photo assistant there. I helped the photo department with tasks, but I was also like the guy who knew how to edit video the best. So I produced a lot of news videos, going out to car accidents, going out to marching band competitions, producing whatever news videos the editorial department felt that they might need, including like an extensive series on domestic violence that won some awards. I was laid off from the Frederick News Post in 2008, just as the 2008 recession was starting. I bounced around for a bit. Luckily, I was still living in Shepherdstown, and I got a job at the Shepherdstown Chronicle, where I first started to write by covering town hall. While I was at the Shepherdstown Chronicle, I won an award for investigative journalism to look for a series of articles examining the structural conditions that underlie the town's reasons to annex the dormitories on the west side of Shepherd University. Basically, stuff tied to how gambling revenue is allocated among municipalities in counties that have racetracks. It's done by population, and between 2000 and 2010, Ranson and Charlestown just kept doing these spaghetti string annexations that boosted their population while Shepherdstown's population remained the same. as a result, they're about to lose like $1 million a year in government funding or something like that, if unless they found a way to add 600 residents right quick. Um, from the Shepherdstown Chronicle, I started as a local editor at AOL's Pack.com network of hyperlocal websites in the Washington, D.C. area. If you may remember 10 years ago, if you lived in a suburb of a major city like in the Northeast, there was a new news website in your town that popped up whose entire business model was to drop a journalist in a town and have them produce news about anything that was going on in that town. They expanded from like 30 websites in the New York and Boston area to 900 websites between 2009 and 2010. And I was one of those 900 hired on in that kind of second wave there. I launched the site in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where it competed well against the freelance Star, and I kind of dove further into covering government there, kind of based on my experience covering town hall in Shepherdstown. On the strength of that work, I then came up closer to the DC area to run a patch website in my hometown of Hyattsville and Hyattsville, Maryland, and Prince George's County, Maryland, where I grew up. And I stayed at the AOL until they decided to dramatically scale back operations at Patch in late 2013. They went from 900 editors down to, or a staff of 1,000 essentially, including support, down to about 200 to run a network of 900 websites. AOL subsequently sold that to a investment firm that is still running it and is finding ways to make money, but they still have a lot more sites than journalists, and their footprint is weird now, if you ask me. From Patch, I went to the Austin Business Journal in Austin, Texas, where I worked as their digital editor. I managed their social media. Outlets for a while. Then I transitioned into their City Hall reporter role, and covered things like the expansion of ride sharing in Austin, a fight between Uber and Lyft and City Hall there that I think was notable for just the way I kind of attacked that story from a document perspective, and the way that the lobbying happened there. It's a weird part of my career that has left me with like an absurd amount of detailed information about just how ride sharing works and ride sharing insurance. That information I'll have forever and never leave my brain, you know. Since in late 2018, I moved back to Washington, D.C. due to my partner's career fortunes. I quit the Austin Business Journal and started looking for work in the DC area. As a journalist, there's a lot of trade publications here. So there seems to be a steady stream of job openings in this area. While I was applying for those jobs, it took me about 1.5 years to get a staff position. I did some freelancing for the Washington Business Journal and some other publications. While I was waiting around filing job applications, in 2018, I also launched a subscriber-supported local news website covering Prince George's County in Maryland's Washington, D.C. suburbs, which I continue to run as a side hustle. It's supported on Patreon, and you have to like subscribe to read many of the articles, particularly ones about like commercial real estate. About 2 years ago, I started the Chronicle of Philanthropy as their data and accountability reporter. And in that role, I run a lot of their data projects, survey projects. Most recently, I did an analysis of IRS records in the database for information that nonprofits have to file on their 990s, that looked at grants from charities to groups on the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of hate groups, and found something like $53 million since 2013 has gone from charities to groups many people consider to not really have charitable intent because of their work to disenfranchise people or work against civil rights or work against LGBTQ equality, that kind of stuff. That kind of brings us to the present day. I've been working from home for the last several months, like many of you are doing, and yeah.
So who's going to be the first one to brave a question?
I will. I got a good question, I think, maybe. So you have quite the resume. I'm just wondering, are you where you want to be, or do you see yourself going any further in like getting a higher, like, do you have any other goals going forward, or do you see yourself establishing your career after all those resumes?
Yeah, I guess at this point I consider myself fairly well into my career, kind of mid-career almost. In terms of where I want to be, I have like personal kind of aspirational goals. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. My daily paper was the Washington Post. And there's a part of me that feels like it's kind of like the home team. And I, to this day, would consider it an honor to work at the Washington Post in some capacity, even covering local news, because they do some great stuff with the county that I grew up in, and the county that I still love dearly, where all my family lives. And more broadly, I think I would like to, at some point, become an editor or lead a team of reporters, that kind of thing. That's just, it's almost kind of the thing you have to say at this point in your career, especially when you're talking to your own boss. You can't just say, well, I'd really like to work at the Washington Post, but you can talk about how you desire just more responsibility. From a skill perspective, that's, I think, where a lot of my most nuanced goals are. Over the course of my career, one thing I haven't gotten into is, like, I'm a data journalist now. I started out as a photographer and videographer. And along the way, I've like slowly accumulated skills with mapping data, mapping census data, mapping population data, that has now got me into a position where I'm doing like analysis on government databases using the query language SQL, just to run basic filters on large data sets to get them to a position where I can work with them and analyze them. And that was a transition that, like 10 years ago, definitely when I worked at the Frederick News Post, if you'd told me, you know, you would be writing articles and working mostly with databases now, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But I think what Professor Larson referred to earlier about flexibility, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I guess to answer your question most directly, right now, for personal goals, I really want to further develop my skills with like data analysis and programming languages like Python, kind of these nimble, easy to learn programming languages that kind of set you apart from other journalists, in that most of them only know how to write, and they don't know how to do a lot of other stuff, which is where some of the skills with videography and video editing have also helped me to get jobs at Patch, where we were expected to be multimedia journalists. And like a lot of news, especially in a local context today, you're expected not only to write the thing, but also to take the picture and maybe shoot the video and bring that back to the newsroom if you can. But yeah, I think continuing to broaden my skills and make myself like a Swiss Army knife journalist, someone who's able to work in different mediums with ease, and translate even the same story across multiple mediums, or at least be able to pitch the same idea across multiple mediums.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. That's awesome.
I guess with that said, Mike, I'm wondering what you might have been interested, like if you had to go back to your days when you were sitting in the comm department, what might you have liked to learn more? Would you have taken more computer classes? Uh, how much writing did you do? I know that you were a mass comm person, but you were otherwise photography. Do you wish that you'd done anything differently?
Um, yeah, looking back on it, I would have liked to have taken more electives at least in um, computer science or data analysis related things, or even just learning any programming language can kind of give you insight into how to approach other programming languages. And in some weird ways, I did start to dabble in some of that stuff in my video editing courses, like with Adobe After Effects, which has its own proprietary programming language, which you can use to move elements around the video screen. Let's see. And yeah, I think knowing what I know now, knowing where I ended up, like a firmer foundation around computer science programming language and data analysis would be helpful. I'm not, yeah, I think that would probably have to come in an elective, but I don't know. Any of these tools can be applied to a comm context.
Come on, kids, let's not be shy.
Uh, I was kind of like fascinated about the ride sharing story you did in Austin, Texas. Can you like elaborate on that a little bit more?
Christian Anderson, I just got over to that side of the screen.
Yeah, that was Christian Anderson.
Oh, cool. All right then.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I inherited the City Hall beat from a departing reporter in, I think, mid 2014, Uber and Lyft had just entered the Austin market illegally. What they did in many cities, they started operating this ride sharing service, in cities where the only places you're allowed to drive people around for fares are licensed taxi cab companies. And there are like laws around it. And they do this thing where they came in, and the city hall's like, you can't do this. And they're like, fine, we're leaving. And then they start like an outrage campaign. And then that builds pressure for City Hall to then create rules for these companies to come in and essentially undercut a unionized taxi cab local monopoly, if we're being honest. That throughout that process, my job as the Austin Business Journal's reporter was to develop business intelligence through our reporting about what City Hall was considering with regards to ride sharing, and just kind of reporting around that topic. And so that took many different avenues. On like the policy front, it was keeping track of proposals to regulate ride sharing that city council was developing, and just reporting on how those votes were moving through committee and how city council was feeling about them, what Uber and Lyft's lobbyists feel about them. There was another part of it of trying to explain more about just the ride sharing industry in general. There was a portion of time where Austin kicked out Uber and Lyft. They passed a set of rules. They're like, these are going to be our ride sharing regulations. Uber and Lyft were like, cool, we don't like them, we're leaving. And so when they did that, about 15 other tiny, and from my experience, buggy, bad ride sharing competitors came in and tried to fill that space. And so that, from a business journal's perspective, was just a story about a lot of businesses trying to get a toehold in here. And so I tried to write a story about each and every one. I kept a tracker on all the different ride sharing apps you can use in Austin. I tested them. to just see for myself how they ran. Wrote about their own efforts dealing with the regulation that they're supposed to be operating under. And because it was kind of a gold rush, there's a bunch of weird like Bitcoin companies that were trying to do things in weird illegal ways, and just covering everything around ride sharing. A crucial portion that the thread that runs through all of that is uh, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, or what they're called in Texas at the local level, Public Information Act requests, on a weekly basis for all emails from all these ride sharing lobbyists and ride sharing executives going to certain city officials, and keeping track of and keeping a rolling flood of emails to and from these lobbyists and public officials about the ride sharing regulations and stuff. And so from that stream of basically intercepted emails, I'm finding interesting stories and doing stuff like that. It was almost every angle about ride sharing you could look into. I did it in the context of Austin and Uber and Lyft's departure and their eventual return, which then caused all the other ones to close down.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Terrence Anderson.
Yeah, that's me. Okay. I had a question about being a freelance journalist. What are some of like the financial realities of being a journalist? How's being like a freelance journalist, you know?
I've probably written 10 freelance articles in my entire life. I'm not a good freelancer. It requires an amount of hustle that I don't believe I possess, and it requires a lot of connections. In fact, the people who you see are most frequently freelance writers are people who have come out on the other side of a staff writing career, and maybe have worked at a number of publications and know who the editors are and know who they can email to pitch. As someone still, as recently as a few years ago, considering myself an early career journalist, I found it just kind of very hard. In Austin, there was a publication called the Austin Monitor, which was a nonprofit subscription-based local news website that just wrote exclusively about policy issues coming out of Austin City Hall. And they had some significant buy-in from like the corporate philanthropic world in Austin. And so they had the funding to give out for local writers, and they employed a small team of freelancers whose entire job it seemed to be writing for those organizations, or writing for the Austin Monitor, or at least supplementing their income in some way. It's hard to be just a freelancer, especially in an era of smaller newsrooms. Oddly, the thinking is often, why we have a guy on staff, we can add another one of his stories to this plate. But that might be just me. There are also people my age, like I said, those guys at the Austin Monitor, other people who just seem to have these connections and know who to email to get a story off the ground. But yeah, try to staff up if you can.
Thank you.
See a question from Ryan.
Yes. When you were first starting off, how did you go about building those connections and kind of like overstepping your boundaries?
That's a good question. Well, to touch back on Professor Larson's question about stuff I did at Shepherd, I think you asked, would I take a writing class? I worked for the Shepherd Picket, at first as a photo editor. I worked at the Picket throughout my entire time there, kind of mostly to support my photography minor. But that got me valuable experience with people who were interested in careers in the news, and so from the Picket, I first began to interact with Graham Cullen, who I believe may be in some way teaching photojournalism in Shepard's art department now. He's, I believe, now the photo editor at the Frederick News Post. But the connection from Graham Cullen at the Picket was the connection I needed to learn about an opening at the Frederick News Post. After getting laid off at the Frederick News Post, in the last recession was crazy. I mean, the day after, I just walked my resume around to businesses in Shepherdstown, just trying to get any part-time work. And I walked into the Chronicle office and handed him my resume. The editor at the time was Daniel Friend. And then he called me up a couple weeks later, and the Chronicle at the time would pay you $20 to write an article for him. And so I started freelancing for $20 a pop while I was washing dishes at 2 restaurants in Charlestown. And from there, after like a couple months of writing articles, business articles for the Shepherdstown Chronicle, there was an opening at the Shepherdstown Chronicle. It's a newspaper with 2 people employed by it. And their editorial assistant was leaving. Officially, my job was to answer the phones and place classified ads when people called in. But because it's a newspaper, a 2-person newspaper, he was also like, do you want to cover City Hall too? And I was like, yeah, sure. And so that's how I first started covering government and just kind of used it as a laboratory. I started filing Public Information Act requests at Shepherdstown Town Hall, and that just kind of doing the same thing. That's how I won the investigative journalism thing. So there was a connection. The thread there is from a guy at the Picket to the Frederick News Post to getting laid off to just walking around and working at a newspaper with a circulation of 1,500.
Thank you.
Well, actually, let me expand on that answer a little bit more, because now Chris Brown was also a Shepherd University graduate with a minor in journalism. He got a job at Patch before me and let me know that Patch was hiring. And so that's another Shepherd connection. So, but I guess it kind of goes to show it's the people you go to school with sometimes that those guys who get that job first in your field can be a help. And I think the Picket helped me there, certainly, without even really realizing it, because I was pressed into writing at the Picket in my senior year just because we needed writers. And they were like, you can write too. So. Juno, let me know.
Yep, that was right. So you had just mentioned talking about working for the Picket on campus. I was wondering if you happen to have done any unpaid or paid internships with photojournalism or anything of the sorts while you're as an undergrad.
All my internships were paid. So I got a job as a cameraman at WHAG, running their morning broadcast, and at least at the time, it was a media job, and so I just used it as my internship. I would, I'm not sure everyone, I don't know. I don't like unpaid internships for economic justice reasons, social justice reasons. Don't do them. Don't give people your labor for free. That's my biggest tip. So.
Although I would say if you are given school credit, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
Just one of those things that there's a flip side to that too, that if you are actually being taught where you're at an organization, then you are being paid in some respects. So if you are actually doing real work, it's a different thing. But just my little plug essay, since they are required to have an internship, it's best if you can get it paid, but sometimes it doesn't happen that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that paid versus unpaid internship thing drives a lot of the inequities we see perhaps in the, I know in newsrooms certainly, but yeah.
It depends on how much instruction you get. I mean, if you go in and you're an unpaid intern, you advocate for yourself and you learn and you're taught and you make sure that you're costing them more than you're gaining them in terms of information. Make sure the information flow is one direction. That would be my opinion, but I have a question actually. The role of the journalist in society has been challenged a lot lately with the advent of fake news and things like that. How has that, affected your career as, especially when you were covering politics and things? How did it affect you?
That's a good question. Up until very recently, all of my career was in local news. And with the exception of Austin, all of my career has been hyperlocal news for small suburban or smaller sized communities. In those contexts, I have found if you're a good journalist, in a local context, people want to know what's going on. Why is there a pothole in the road? That kind of thing. It's hard to call the pothole down the road fake news, a lot of the decisions you write about have happened. Things can get dicey when you get into the intersection of cultural politics and local politics. In Fredericksburg, Virginia, I covered city council meetings that, where topics trying to reckon with the city's history of enslavement, how it benefited from the pre-Civil War economy, how it segregated its economy and its community with effects that last to this day. Some of those topics naturally get more divisive, and the things you choose to write about regarding those topics can be attacked in the comments. Now that I'm covering politics on a national level, I just last week wrote a story about hate groups, and you get into those areas where as a journalist, I'm starting to deal more with the fact that the people I'm interviewing, if they're on different sides of an issue, are describing different versions of reality in ways that are uncomfortable for a journalist to navigate. The SPLC group is an example where at least someone would say, I think most people will agree the KKK is a hate group. This is something I had a leader of a hate group tell me last week. But they're not a hate group. We're a pro-family group that has nothing to do with racism, or you get into that nebulous area of what is and is not a hate group, and should we even be on this list? And so we got letters to the editor kind of around that topic, like the Southern Poverty Law Center can't be trusted, that kind of stuff. And, as a journalist, you just write what you fall into that trap of. You have to kind of, if you mention the pro-family group in your story received a grant from this major charity, you have to ask them about it, and they get to say their piece, and you just write it. And at the end of the day, I think, unfortunately, that's all you can do. That you can see, I feel weary looking into that dilemma, especially now. But cite your sources and let God sort them out.
Very good.
Nuha? Sorry if I mangled that.
Yes, it's Nuha. So I have a question about social media. I was wondering, sort of as a journalist, how do you leverage social media to sort of for your work? And if maybe you have any advice for us, how we can leverage it to sort of in our careers.
Yeah. Um, I leverage social media in a few different ways. Let me start off, operationally, professionally, I will use social media to develop leads on stories, especially in a local news context. If you are ever a local news journalist, I highly recommend you sign up for. Your town has a Facebook group where people bitch about the pothole down the street, the crazy thing the city council person said last week, the crazy person the city council person emailed me privately. There are places where people are talking about the things that more people need to know about. I think in local journalism, one thing I've noticed in local journalism is that as there is less and less of it, more and more of the discourse around local news is happening in these unregulated environments on these Facebook groups where rumors can fly, and there's an opportunity there for journalists to spot the controversial post and maybe then make some phone calls. Janie says, the police did this and that. You call the police, ask them what happened. Call Janie, ask her what she saw directly. I do that less and less with, like, at the national level politics. It's very much, you get press releases about stuff. You're not really finding scoops. If you're searching for a topic, honestly, the thing you're finding on social media is that other people have covered this story before. Then professionally, I'm using social media to get my work out there. It's how most people encounter their news these days. I'm using it to call for sources. I'm on Twitter. I'm frequently tagging the people I'm writing about just to let them know and to get them to share it with their networks if they feel they want to. And yeah, I think it's a great tool for sourcing, broadly speaking, in a journalistic context. I see a question from Chelsea and then Isaka.
Yeah, so considering like you've covered news on like a very local and like a national level, would you say that you have a preference? And do you think that there's like an obligation to move up to that higher national level in order to like be more established in your career?
Ooh, I do have a preference. I like local news more. I can see the effect of local news happen in a way, and you feel that the things you write about have a tangible impact. I like to just about local policy in general. It is crazy to me that more people are concerned, that more people have an opinion about the presidential race than have an opinion about who their mayor is. That is nuts to me because it is the local police who are pulling you over. All these national hot button issues, so many of them are at the end of the day local issues. The lead water pipes in Flint is a city hall story. Like every police shooting is a local news story first. And it's crazy to me that people have no insight into it. And the economics there you alluded to in your question are that local news pay sucks. Local news is going away. I'm not telling you anything new here. There's fewer and fewer newspapers. COVID is killing even more of them. But it's where the rubber meets the road at the end of the day. And I would love to cover only, I would love to really dive into like local news in Prince George's County. That's the Washington Post aspiration I had. Like, I would love to work at the Washington Post, not necessarily to cover the White House, but to cover Upper Marlboro, Maryland.
Thank you.
Oh, you asked about the obligation. No, I think like I think there needs to be like an AmeriCorps for journalists that keeps that keeps talented journalists with the skills that I now have at 10 years. Like, it's very hard for someone with the salary I can now justifiably command, I think, to find a job in a newsroom that covers only local issues outside of a big metro area that'll have a Washington Post sized newspaper with one reporter covering Prince George's County, Maryland. I think the only obligation there is to feed yourself, and that will necessarily force you up the chain, unfortunately. Next question, Isaac. Sorry if I mangled that.
No, you're good. So like being a journalist, is there anything that like you feel like you can't write about, or any topics like you try to stay away from? Because like I know in some other countries, like people like fear for their lives, or if they write about a certain thing, or like whistleblowing, stuff like that.
I guess I haven't, there was maybe only one time where I was ever sometimes, I guess the big answer is no. I'm not scared of writing about any topic. Because at the end of the day, at least as an editorial journalist, I mean, which inside a newsroom, and there's the opinion in the editorial section, and the editorial is the newsroom. That's where like the objective news reporting should be going on. The editorial process would mean that like any controversial topic I'm writing about, ultimately it's not my voice. It's I'm writing about topic X. Should America become a communist country run like Stalin ran Russia? That's probably a pretty controversial article, I guess. But it would be ultimately, this guy says yes, this guy says no. Which it's a bit different, I guess, as an op-ed writer. There might be some topics that people think are forbidden. You'll sometimes hear comedians perhaps complain that of the PC police. I don't really think that there's a problem with topic censorship related to like PC issues or cancel culture. I think a lot of times those are people who just say things that it happens to be that most people find reprehensible. And if, you know, you try to write something that is perhaps in a sloppy way, covers a topic or can shed sympathy on something that many people find reprehensible, you run the risk of being canceled. But I think a lot of that comes down to how your editors approach a story. I've unfortunately been witness to some ham-handed efforts written in a newsroom of white men pitching ideas about how to write about gender diversity in Austin's tech scene, led to an article I thought was cringy, but I didn't write it. So I was just kind of a spectator in the newsroom listening to these discussions going like, oh crap. But I was also much further down on the totem pole to be able to step in. Maybe that's wrong of me, actually. I probably could have said something, but you go, no. I think if you write a cringy article, that's the biggest risk you take in terms of a topic. There's a way to approach any topic. You know.
I have a student who has some bad Wi-Fi, but she asked, what pushes you out of your comfort zone? Or as he was developing his career, what projects or jobs really helped him to grow?
Yeah. So I think I owe my career as my evolution into a data journalist to a mandatory training session that AOL had at Patch, where they called in some trainers from the Knight Institute for Journalism. And they were just like, okay, we're going to show you a couple websites you can use to make maps based on with news data sets with census data, that kind of stuff. And so that was a day I wasn't expecting to, I wasn't looking for that expertise when I walked in there that day. But coming out of it, suddenly the managers wanted data projects and stuff. And they had taught us the little bit of tricks necessary to make your first basic ones. But from there, you just, by doing it a lot, you just kind of organically learned how to do more. And then at one point, the national office, started a data team, and I was assigned to it because it had just fallen to me. And that kind of really further ramped things up, again, without me really pushing for it, or that situation where you didn't expect to learn this skill that then becomes very important. So yeah, that and learning Excel. You should all learn how to like filter data and look up data on search data sets using Google spreadsheets and Microsoft Excel. That's half my job is working in a Google spreadsheet these days. Like when I talk about how I use SQL for data analysis, what I'm doing is I'm taking an enormous data set with several million records, and I'm writing a 3-line query, select all these columns where this variable equals this number, and it just quickly filters it down to something that I can then just put into a spreadsheet and work with. The spreadsheets are just a lot more flexible to just play around with data that then you can then dump back into something like a map. Because a lot of the maps you see, like an election county map, behind it is really just a spreadsheet with a list of counties and a list of variables describing whether they should be red or blue, red, blue, and then the map just takes that and spits it out there. Another question from Nuha?
Yeah. Do you have a paid internship that we could apply for?
I'm afraid I do not have a paid internship. Oh, Chronicle of Philanthropy has paid internships, actually. I'll send information to Professor Larson after this.
All right, thank you.
And in case
I thought you were asking me personally.
in case anybody else is looking for a paid internship, we also have a local real estate agent that wants social media done for her, and she is a paying intern. So contact me for that one too. Any other questions, guys? Just looking. All right. Anything else? Last words of wisdoms, Mike?
I guess to kind of bring it back to the intro, I had the great fortune of really getting my first job just before the Great Recession started, and was laid off less than a year into my job at the Frederick News Post. But I was just kind of staying flexible and being willing to add tools to your skill set, learning a little bit of data, knowing how to edit some video, knowing how to take a pleasingly composed photograph, knowing the bare minimum of HTML are skills that will set you apart from people who in your career will find are perhaps more specialized. At least in the context of written journalism, I think it makes you stand out against most of your peers who mostly focus on just writing. Being able to come in and say, I can write the story and I can whip up a little data visual, or I can write the story and I've got these photos from the crime scene and the photos from the crime scene look good. Because every other journalist will say that they're a photographer, but most of them are bad photographers. So like, read photography books, find a street photographer who's your favorite street photographer, look at their work and ask yourself why you like that particular street photographer's work. Learn aesthetics, learn data. It's communications, it's a broad field now. And I'm a journalist until at least until I become a consultant, which it seems we all inevitably do. So.
Just out of curiosity, show of hands, how many of you feel perfectly comfortable manipulating data in an Excel spreadsheet? Well, thank you, Michael. I think we got some work to do.
Excellent.
Excellent. That's a new unit in advanced internet technologies. We will be there. So thanks very much for your time, and everybody, thanks for participating. Everybody have a good rest of your evening. Bye-bye.